Whether an event is remembered or not often depends on what else is going on at the same time. Today, we're going to tell you of a man involved in a historic tragedy that not many people have heard of because of the assassination of a president. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia.
So, Steve, this was a story that was kind of, I guess, tucked away, hidden away under the headlines of the assassination of a president. Now, I'm not
Yes.
sure which president it might have been. I'm kind of guessing Lincoln, maybe. Is that maybe the one we're thinking about?
Yeah, we're talking the end of the Civil War. A lot of things
Okay.
were going on after the Civil War. And this particular incident, which any other time would have been news of the world, got smothered in the search for Lincoln's assassin.
Wow. Well, this is a story I'm looking forward to hearing because I didn't know anything about this. I'd never heard about it, but of course, like you said, this stuff was hidden, back in the headlines of everything else, looking for John Wilkes Booth and so forth. So, yeah, this is probably one of those things, unless you're a real history buff, you wouldn't know about.
And the way we're going to tell this is actually not to tell necessarily this story about what happened, as much as one man from Appalachia who was involved in the middle of it. And that man's name was Pleasant Marion Keble, who was born in Blount County, Tennessee, on September 13th, 1845, to Manly and Rebecca Keble. Now, by the time he reached adulthood, the Civil War had been underway for 2 years. And like many other young men in East Tennessee, he was a Unionist, and as such, he joined the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, U.S., to fight the Confederacy.
Well, the 3rd Tennessee was formed on January 27th, 1863, and saw action throughout the South during the war, fighting in the Battle of Nashville, the Battle of Stones River, and in the Tullahoma Campaign, among others. Now, the unit also fought in the Battle of Sulphur Branch Trestle, also known as the Battle of Athens, Alabama, and it was there that a large part of the 3rd were captured by the Confederates, and they, including Pleasant Keble, were packed off to the Cahaba prison in Alabama as prisoners of war.
Well, after the war ended in April 1865, the captured soldiers of the 3rd Tennessee were paroled and sent to Vicksburg, Mississippi for transportation back north. And it was at Vicksburg that the side-wheel steamboat Sultana from Illinois arrived that month to deliver goods. While there, the captain of the boat, one James Mason, was asked to transport Union prisoners of war who were gathered in that city to the north. And he wasn't asked to do it for free, Rod. He was told that they would pay him $2.75 a man, the equivalent of about $50 today. Now, seeing a tremendous profit before his eyes, Mason agreed to take on 1,900 former POWs for transport, which I guess might not sound too bad until you happen to realize, Rod, that the steamboat had a capacity of 376.
Oh my gosh, this sounds like one of those third world country incidents, when they get one of the ferries crammed with people and they go down. We don't hear about them as much as we used to, but at one time, cramming these people on there with everything, and then the boat sinks. Oh my gosh. But anyway, men were crowded on every possible deck, roof, or other place available. Now, this was in addition to crew and other goods being delivered and packed up at various ports. So the steamship moved on toward Memphis to unload a cargo of sugar. Oh, by the way, did we mention that this overloaded boat was also having mechanical problems? Because the steamboat arrived in Vicksburg, there were problems with the steam boiler, the device that powered it. Now, attempts were made to repair the boiler, but the engineers informed Captain Mason that it would take several days to make complete repairs so as to make the boiler safe. A few days, though, meant that some other boats would have to swoop in and load those POWs and take all that sweet profit away from James Mason.
Well, Rod, the captain decided to ignore the engineer's advice. Surprise, surprise, and proceed full steam ahead. On the evening of April 26th, the Sultana arrived at Memphis, unloaded its sugar cargo, then set course up the Mississippi toward Illinois. And later that night, tragedy struck. Around 2 in the morning of April 27th, 1865, the Sultana's boiler suddenly and violently exploded, releasing an enormous blast of steam aimed directly at the passengers on the main deck, scalding many of them horribly. The boat then began to sink into the Mississippi River. And Rod, what of Pleasant Keeble?
Well, Pleasant Keeble was trying to get a little sleep on the hurricane deck of the Sultana at around 2 a.m. His brother, John Keeble, who had also been in the 3rd Tennessee and had also been a POW, was on an upper deck, the Texas deck, when the explosion happened. Pleasant awoke to the crush of men trying to flee the ship down the stairs. He was carried along by the mass of men until he reached the stairway, where he managed to wedge himself against the railing, from which he pulled himself up above the fleeing men. Remembering his brother, Pleasant climbed over the men as they went back toward the hurricane deck. From there, he climbed up to the Texas deck, only to find a collapsed smokestack and a hole where that deck had been. He never found his brother.
After giving up the search, Pleasant Keeble stripped out of his clothes, grabbed a nearby wooden box, and jumped into the Mississippi, holding on to that box for dear life to keep afloat. Not long after he entered the water, part of the boat's wheelhouse collapsed into the river, and Pleasant, along with 5 other men, swam toward it and safety. Well, Rod, it was safe until the mule came. You see, in addition to the men and goods on the Sultana, all 1,900 of them, there was livestock, one of which was a very determined mule. This mule, too, saw that wheelhouse collapse into the Mississippi, and it, too, thought that, well, that was a very good place to seek safety. So those 5 men were treated to the side of a terrified mule paddling itself toward their little makeshift raft. The mule tried again and again and again to climb up with the men, nearly capsizing their makeshift raft, until finally they managed to shoo it away. Off swam the mule to find either the shore, another piece of the Sultana to climb onto, or drown, and we frankly don't know the fate of that mule.
That's the reason why mules are stubborn sometimes. They're persistent. Oh, well.
Yeah, indeed.
Eventually, the raft found its way to the riverbank, where a former slave fished the men out of the water with a long pole. Pleasant Keeble eventually made it back to Blount County, where he married Margaret Elizabeth McTeer. The couple had 10 children, eventually moving to Keeble Drive in Knox County. Pleasant spent his life as a farmer and a chimney builder. And every year, on April 27th, the survivors of the Sultana disaster in East Tennessee hold a reunion at Rockford Presbyterian Church. Now, the last actual reunion happened in 1929, when Pleasant Keeble, in his 80s by that time and sporting a very distinguished-looking walrus mustache — that's one thing I would love to have, is a walrus mustache, but I digress — and Colonel J.H. Simpson were the only ones in attendance. By 1930, Colonel Simpson had passed away, and it was only Pleasant Keeble at the gathering.
Pleasant Keeble developed pneumonia and died the following year on March 4th, 1931. Now, his death was covered in newspapers across the region, and he was celebrated as the last living survivor of the Sultana explosion. However, it later turned out that he actually wasn't. You see, it was discovered after his death that there were 2 other members of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry still alive: Charles M. Eldridge, who was in a California soldier's home, and Samuel W. Jenkins of Knoxville. And Mr. Jenkins was the last of these men to die on January 19th, 1933. As we said, the Sultana explosion failed to get a lot of newspaper attention because it was overshadowed by another bigger event. You see, 2 weeks before that incident, President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington by John Wilkes Booth. Booth had escaped capture and gotten out of D.C., so a manhunt was underway. And it just so happens that Booth was discovered hiding in a tobacco barn in Virginia and had been shot and killed when he tried to escape a fire that had been set in the barn by Union soldiers. Now, that was the very day before the Sultana explosion. So as you can imagine, that stunning news wiped everything else, including the Sultana explosion, off the front page the next day.
Wow. That's just unbelievable, hearing that, and then knowing that this whole thing those remaining members, those guys that survived also. So they were part of a small group right there was what they were. But I tell you, and then all of this information be wiped off the front page because it was big news. And all of this wiped off the front page because, well, I guess you could say a national emergency had taken place with John Wilkes Booth assassinating the president, and they were out to get him and find out if they could find him somewhere. And so it made headlines.
It did. Now, the single largest group, or probably one of the largest groups of soldiers that were held prisoner and transported by the Sultana, were members of that 3rd Tennessee Cavalry.
Okay.
So there were tons of them in East Tennessee. And there is now a monument to the Sultana explosion at Mount Olive Cemetery in Knox County, Tennessee. It contains a carving of the steamship and the names of those on board. So folks, go check it out if you get a chance and you're in the Knoxville area.
Sounds neat. Sounds like something to travel to and take a look at, and obviously kind of hold it in esteem because, it was a unique event that took place.
And folks, that's the story of the man once believed to be the last living survivor of the Sultana explosion, Pleasant M. Keeble. Another bit of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. Now, you can subscribe to the Stories Podcast in a whole lot of ways. Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Odyssey, Spotify, Audible, Good Pods, or on your own favorite podcast app. And don't forget, we have a YouTube channel as well that carries these stories and others that we don't do on the audio version. So go on over there, watch our video podcast, and give us a big thumbs up and click that subscribe button too. Until next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.